Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, host, and our guest is Maurice Samuels, the Betty Jane Anlian Professor of French at Yale University. He specializes in the literature and culture of 19th century France and in Jewish studies. His first book, The Spectacular Past, Popular History and the Novel in 19th Century France, won the Gaddis Smith International Book Prize awarded by the MacMillan Center. Today we'll talk with Professor Samuels about his second book, Inventing the Israelite, Jewish Fiction in 19th Century France, which brings to light an almost totally unknown area of fiction in France. Welcome, Professor Samuels.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the book. Give us an overview of it.
Well, the book is about the first Jewish fiction in French. And by Jewish fiction, I mean fiction by Jews, about Jews, and largely for Jews, produced in France starting in around 1830. So France was, the first country that emancipated the Jews, that gave Jews full civil rights. And it happened in France much earlier than in other countries, during the French Revolution in 1790 and 91. So my theory here is that fiction offered the first generation of Jews who had been born French citizens and who came of age around 1830, that it offered them a kind of laboratory for experimenting with the perils but also the possibilities of their new historical situation. So, what did it mean that they were French citizens? Did it mean that they had to give up their Jewish identity totally? Did it mean that they had to change it in some way? Or did it mean that in order to stay Jewish, they would have to renounce their French identity? So my theory is that they tried to come to terms with those dilemmas by inventing stories about them.
Okay, and they're writing in French?
They're writing in French, yes. It's all in French, yeah.
So what kind of stories were they writing? What were they writing about?
Well, there were lots of different kinds of stories, and one big sort of theme was romantic dilemmas. So often you get these stories, and these are very typical of the time in a way. There were lots of kind of sentimental novels about women who were falling in love with someone, like a kind of Romeo and Juliet story, someone who their family didn't like. These Jewish writers transposed that story to come to terms with these Jewish dilemmas. So you would often have a young, beautiful Jewish woman who falls in love with a handsome Christian nobleman, and it causes her family lots of stress. And I try to argue that this isn't just a kind of typical romance plot, it's not a typical romance plot, but it's also trying to kind of come to terms with these central problems, like intermarriage, but also, the weight of the past, of tradition. Should they be loyal to Judaism, or should they, can they kind of declare their autonomy?
Right. Did you find any kind of, any kind of controversial kind of writings?
Yeah, well, a lot of these writings were controversial for the Jewish community.
In what way?
Well, a lot of them tried to come to terms with really kind of burning questions at the time. Everything from should we maintain all the Sabbath rules? Intermarriage, as I said, was a burning question then, as it is now. What happens? Yeah.
What did happen during that time period? Were there intermarriages?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Actually, historians, other than myself, have determined that actually France had relatively low levels of intermarriage and conversion compared to Germany and to other countries, partly because French Jews had much less to gain from it, in a sense, because they were full equal citizens. They didn't have to try to become.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is kind of, cutting edge, trailblazing in a way, because this is the first time anyone has really looked at these kinds of books. What led you to pursue this? Well,
partly a historical question. So historians have often given 19th century French Jews a bad rap. They've accused them of being total assimilators. This was the kind of traditional view that 19th century French Jews, as soon as they could become French citizens, gladly abandoned their Jewish identity and wanted nothing more to do with it. And this was all fine until the Dreyfus affair at the end of the 19th century, and then, of course, World War II, when things went very bad. So and this was also, we see this actually in how they've looked at Jewish literature. So I teach a course on Jews in modern France, and I still use this same textbook that has a chapter on Jewish literature that says there was no Jewish literature in France before the 20th century. Now, I knew from my first book, which was on historical representation in France, that this wasn't totally true. So when I was researching that book, I came across a historical novel called La Juive, the Jewess, written by this woman named Eugénie Fauat from the 1830s. And I was a little curious about it, so I read it, and it was all about a kind of Jewish woman having this romantic dilemma.
Was the woman who wrote the book Jewish?
Well, that's what I didn't know. So I did a little bit of research, and I found out that she was, in fact, from a very prominent Jewish family from Bordeaux. And she wrote a bunch of novels at the time about Jews. So when I came across this chapter saying that there was no Jewish fiction in French before 1900, I knew it wasn't true. And that's the kind of, when that happens as a scholar, you know you have to keep researching it. When I decided to write this book, I went back to Eugénie Fauat, tried to figure out, did she write other things? Were there others like her? So that's really how I came to do it.
And how did you do the research? I mean, how many books did you end up finding?
Yeah, well, it was hard because I knew.
Quite the detective, I imagine.
Yeah, and a lot of time in the library in Paris, and which is not such a terrible place to have to do your research. But so I knew that she existed, and I knew she had written a bunch of other things. But how did how do you find out whether there were other people like her? So the first thing I did was they published lists of every novel published in the 19th century. And so the library has those lists. I started to go through them to look for anything kind of Jewish in the title, like a Jewish name or, a title like the Jewess. Yeah.
How many books were on that list? I'm
there
curious.
were thousands of books.
Really?
Thousands.
Wow.
Yes.
Even back then, people were very prolific.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, the novel was everything in theater too, but there were a lot of novels being published. So, I found some stuff, but I had no idea whether and it was really too hard. I couldn't really tell if I was missing things. So the big break came when I started to look at the Jewish newspapers. Now, I knew that they had published these Jewish newspapers starting in 1840. There was a kind of Reform one, and then there was an Orthodox rival. The Reform one is from 1840, the Orthodox one, 1844. So I knew about them, I kind of looked at them, but I started to look at them really carefully, and I realized that they published fiction. So there was all this serial fiction. All of it met my definition by Jews, about Jews, and for Jews. And even more importantly, they reviewed every novel or even play that was about Jews. And so that really convinced me that there was something like a Jewish literary sphere in the mid-19th century, that this was much more than the case of one single author. In fact, there was a lot going on.
How amazing is that, though, to read in a textbook this doesn't exist, and then to say, wow, there's and how many books do you think ended up finding?
I focus in my book on, there were dozens and dozens of Jewish writers. Not all of them wrote about Jews. So I only talked about the ones that really directly thematized questions of Jewish identity at the time. And so I have 6 chapters in the book, and I would say I talk about maybe 8 to 10 writers in detail. I mention a lot of other ones. And each one of those, I tried to focus on ones, each one represents a different kind of point on the ideological spectrum. From total assimilation, some of them did want to totally assimilate, to reform, like we'll change the religion, to a kind of version of neo-orthodoxy, of kind of returning to the kind of tradition. And what I'm trying to argue is that the picture that we get of Jews is much more complicated than this idea that they were total assimilators. In fact, there were lots of responses to those dilemmas. Quite
the range on the spectrum. Yeah. So how many was it mostly men writing, or was it women, or was it pretty equal?
Yeah, so the first one is, I really determined that Eugénie Fauat had been the first one. And in a way, so a woman, In a way, that's not totally surprising because at the beginning in the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, the novel was still kind of written a lot of times by women and for a female audience. So it's not surprising that a woman would be the first one. But she's really kind of my only woman. In fact, most of the rest of them were men.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And how astute was the writing? I mean, quality-wise, I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a question that I get a lot. Are these writers any good? Did I find a Kafka, a kind of diamond in the rough that we didn't know about? The answer is pretty much no. I didn't find any, quote-unquote great writer. In fact, these writers are mostly working according to kind of the generic conventions of the day, so they're writing kind of, very typical novels. But one thing that really surprised me was that the more I started to read them, the more I started to appreciate them and to like them and to even think that they were actually pretty good. So it was a matter of recovering the kind of questions that they were answering. And once I knew what those were, I started to realize how actually inventive they were, both ideologically, but also literarily. And I started to kind of appreciate the small and kind of subtle ways that they deviated from those generic conventions started to seem very clever to me. So I don't know if I had been kind of, I just read too many of these novels, but I did start to appreciate them.
Interesting. So now, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think, more and more people will be now aware that these things exist?
That's my hope, is that I can try to, get these novels into circulation. So, are these going to be put on every PhD reading list? Probably not. Are they, but I already edited last year an anthology in English of some of my favorite ones, where I did translations of them. And I'm next year this book is being translated into French, and to go along with the publication of it, I'm also editing an anthology in French of these stories. So I'm hoping that they'll have a life. And there's starting to be some signs. I was actually asked to be on a PhD thesis defense at NYU of someone who had worked on these after reading my book. So I was kind of excited about that. Yeah.
So there is.
And I'm feeding them to my students here too. So
so more and more people will be made aware of them.
Exactly. It's exciting that these things, no one had basically read them for 150 years, and now for them to have a second life.
Yeah. So that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and sharing some of your work.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Okay. For more information about Professor Samuels and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.